I'm Madeline Carter, 15 years old, and I can still remember the sound of my mother's voice as clearly as the monitors beside my bed. "We just can't afford it," she said, her tone flat final. The doctor had just told us that I needed immediate treatment if I wanted a real chance to live. My father stared at the floor. My mother folded her arms, and I watched the words settle into the air between us like frost. When they walked out of that hospital room, I understood for the first time what it meant to be truly alone. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever learned the hard way that family isn't always the same as love. I grew up in a tidy neighborhood outside of Columbus, Ohio, in a house where everything had its place, and emotions were treated like clutter. My parents ran a small academic consulting business that catered to families chasing scholarships and elite college admissions. They believed that every decision in life should be practical, measurable, beneficial, profitable. Love wasn't something they said out loud. It was something you were supposed to earn. I learned early to stay quiet to get good grades and to stay out of the way when things revolved around my younger sister, Isabel. She was the one they called gifted, the one who danced across recital stages and filled their social feeds with medals and smiles. I was proud of her, but sometimes it felt like living in her shadow meant I barely existed. Our house always smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. My mother's voice carried through the walls, crisp and efficient, managing clients and future plans. My father handled spreadsheets, tuition charts, and private school brochures, while Isabel practiced piano scales upstairs. When my report cards came home with straight A's, they nodded politely and asked me to help Isabel with her homework. I told myself that being dependable was its own kind of worth. I thought if I just kept trying one day, they might see me the way they saw her, full of possibility. The day I got sick, everything shifted. It started with dizziness that wouldn't go away, then bruises that took too long to fade. I was admitted for tests, and when the doctor came back, his face told me the answer before his words did. It was serious. The treatment would be aggressive, immediate, and expensive. He looked from me to my parents, waiting for reassurance. I did too. Instead, I saw hesitation in their eyes, a silent calculation I couldn't yet name. The doctor explained everything carefully, the process, the timeline, the odds, but my mother stopped listening the moment he mentioned cost. "We won't be moving forward," she said, her voice clipped, like she was canceling a dinner reservation. I thought I'd misunderstood her. "I could die," I whispered, and she sighed as if I'd made things awkward. "We've already set aside Isabel's college fund," she said. "We can't sacrifice her future for something uncertain." My father didn't speak. He just nodded faintly, avoiding my eyes. The doctor tried again, gentle but firm, explaining that waiting could mean losing the window for treatment. My mother shook her head and said something that still echoes in me. "If it's meant to be, it will be. God has a plan." They turned to leave my father, placing a hand on her back, as if to guide her out faster. I waited for one of them to turn around to look back, to hesitate. Neither did. When the door closed, the air changed. The hum of the machines filled the silence. I remember gripping the side of the bed, my palms slick against the cold metal railing, trying to hold on to something that felt solid. A nurse came in a few minutes later and asked softly, "Are your parents coming back?" I couldn't answer. I didn't know if they ever would. The truth was, I had felt this kind of abandonment before, not in one big moment, but in 1,000 small ones. At birthday parties, when my gifts were afterthoughts at dinner tables, where my words went unheard in family photos, where I stood half out of frame. I had learned to make myself small, so no one would have to make room for me. But lying there, surrounded by sterile light and steady beeps, I realized small wouldn't save me now. The nurse adjusted my IV and told me to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I thought about Isabel, her tuition payments, her new laptop, her smiling face framed in the kind of life my parents had built around her. I wondered if she knew what they'd done, if she'd be proud of their decision to let me fade for her sake. My chest ached, not from illness, but from something deeper, heavier, sharper. I didn't cry. I just stared at the ceiling until the shapes in the tiles blurred together, and I whispered to no one, "This isn't how it ends." Outside the window, night pressed against the glass, and in its reflection, I saw someone I barely recognized, pale, trembling, but still breathing. I didn't know what would happen next, only that I wasn't ready to give up. Somewhere in the distance I heard footsteps in the hallway, a nurse's shoes squeaking, the sound of a phone ringing. I told myself that maybe someone somewhere would come through that door and remind me that I mattered. And just before exhaustion pulled me under, I made a quiet promise: if I survived this, if I somehow made it through, I'd never wait for them to choose me again. The next morning, the light in my hospital room was thin and gray. The hallway outside hummed with movement nurses calling to one another, carts rolling, phones ringing. I lay still, listening, waiting for footsteps that never came. The empty chair at the foot of my bed told me everything I needed to know. My parents weren't coming back. Doctor Wilson appeared around 9, his white coat slightly wrinkled, eyes heavy from a long night. He asked about my pain, checked the monitor, and glanced toward the door as if expecting someone to walk through it. When no one did, his expression shifted. "Madeline," he said quietly, "we need to discuss the next step. Your condition can't wait." His words were steady, but there was something beneath them, a question he didn't want to ask out loud. I swallowed hard and nodded. "They left," I said. The words scraped on the way out. For a moment he just stood there, stethoscope motionless in his hand, and then he sighed. "All right," he said, more to himself than to me. "We'll contact the social worker." An hour later, a woman I'd never seen before stepped into the room. She wore a navy cardigan and carried a clipboard pressed against her chest. "Hi, Madeline," she said softly. "My name's Elaine. I'm here to help make sure you're taken care of." Her voice was calm, professional, but kind enough that it nearly undid me. She asked about family guardians, anyone who could make medical decisions. I stared at the blanket bunched in my lap, trying to think of someone who hadn't already turned away. "My grandmother," I whispered finally. "Rosemary Carter. I don't know if she still lives at the same place." Elaine smiled gently. "We'll find her," she said, and left the room with quiet determination. Time dragged. The IV pump clicked rhythmically beside me, marking each minute that passed. I tried not to imagine what would happen if Grandma couldn't be reached, if the paperwork stalled, if the decision came too late. When the phone on the wall finally rang, Elaine answered in the hallway. I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear her tone change relief, urgency. Moments later, she appeared in the doorway. "She's on her way," she said. 15 minutes later, the door burst open, and there she was. My grandmother wasn't tall or imposing, but the air seemed to steady when she entered. Her silver curls were half tamed under a knit hat, and her glasses slid down her nose as she hurried to my bedside. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, catching my hand in both of hers. "I'm here now." Something inside me broke at those words. I hadn't realized how cold I'd been until I felt her warmth. She didn't ask what had happened. She could see it in the silence around the bed, in the absence of any other faces. When Dr. Wilson came in with papers to sign, she read every line, carefully asked clear questions, and signed with a firm stroke. "We'll handle the cost," she said, cutting off his attempt to explain the numbers. "Just start what she needs." That night, the machines beeped steadily while I drifted in and out of sleep. Grandma sat in the chair my parents had left empty, knitting needles clicking softly. Each time I stirred, she looked up and smiled. She had brought a small bag with her pajamas that smelled faintly of lavender, a blanket I recognized from her couch, and a little music box that played a tune I hadn't heard since I was a child. She wound it once and set it on the table beside me. The melody filled the room, low and steady, chasing away the sterile quiet. When I woke the next morning, the sun was bright through the blinds, and for the first time in days, the air didn't feel heavy. The nurses smiled when they came in, and one of them whispered, "Your grandmother's a strong one." She was. She spent the day making phone calls, foundations, community programs, anyone who might help with the cost of care. She didn't complain or hesitate. When the doctors explained the treatment schedule, she nodded, took notes, and told them to proceed. I listened from the bed, a little stunned by how easily she carried the weight my parents had dropped. The treatments began that afternoon. They were hard nausea fatigue, a metallic taste that wouldn't go away, but each time I opened my eyes, Grandma was there. Between doses, she read aloud from an old mystery novel, her voice steady even when mine trembled. She never asked about my parents, never repeated their names. She just made space for quiet and healing. After several days, the doctors finally said I could be discharged under strict instructions. Grandma signed more papers and helped me into her car, a faded blue sedan that smelled of mint gum and old books. The drive across town felt like crossing into another world. Her house was small, its yellow paint chipped in places, ivy creeping up the porch rail. But when she opened the door and guided me inside, it felt more like home than anywhere I'd ever been. She set me up in the guest room, freshly made with clean sheets, and a note taped to the mirror that said, "You are safe. You are wanted." I stared at it until my eyes blurred. That night she made oatmeal with cinnamon and honey, the way she used to when I stayed over as a kid. We ate at the little kitchen table while the wind rattled the windows. She didn't fill the silence with questions or pity. She just passed me the sugar bowl and said, "We'll take it one day at a time." Over the next week, she built a routine around me: doctor visits, medication schedules, short walks to the mailbox. Each morning she'd open the curtains and say, "Let's get some light in here." I was still weak, but under that roof I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: steady. One afternoon I found her at the dining table surrounded by paperwork, medical forms, printouts, a stack of envelopes addressed to local charities. "What are you doing?" I asked. She adjusted her glasses and smiled. "Research. There are grants and foundations for cases like yours. We'll figure out the rest." I wanted to argue, to tell her it was too much, but she shook her head before I could speak. "You're not a burden, Maddie," she said, using the nickname no one else remembered. "You're my granddaughter. That's enough." Her words settled in me like sunlight. For years I'd measured my worth by how much I could help or how little I could need. But in that small house with its creaky floors and the smell of coffee drifting through the mornings, I began to believe that maybe survival didn't have to be earned. I started helping where I could, folding laundry, chopping vegetables, reading to her while she knitted. When I was strong enough, we took slow walks down the block. She pointed out the neighbors' gardens, the cats that napped on porch steps, the mailboxes painted with family names. During those walks, she didn't talk about my parents or Isabel. She talked about birds, about recipes, about the way lilacs bloomed late that year. And somehow, those ordinary words began to heal me more than any treatment. Still, the nights were harder. Sometimes I'd wake in the dark, heart pounding, certain that the door would open and they'd be standing there with that same blank expression. But the door never opened, and after a while, I stopped expecting it to. Instead, I'd hear Grandma's soft footsteps in the hallway, a hand on the light switch, and her voice whispering, "You're all right." Winter crept in slowly. My strength returned bit by bit until I could manage a walk to the park at the end of the street. The air was cold, but the sky was clear, and for the first time in months, I felt alive in a way that wasn't fragile. Grandma sat on a bench watching me knitting in her lap, smiling when I turned toward her. That image would stay with me for years, the quiet proof that even after being left behind, there was still a place to belong. I didn't know it then, but healing in that little yellow house was just the beginning. Beneath the calm, something else was starting to grow, a new kind of strength, quiet and certain, waiting for its moment. By the time winter settled in, the sharp edges of fear had softened. I could walk a few blocks without losing my breath, and the small, yellow house had become its own kind of world. The air always carried a mix of cinnamon soap and the faint hum of the old radio Grandma kept in the kitchen. She moved through her days with quiet rhythm, watering plants, folding laundry, humming old hymns while soup simmered on the stove. I learned to match her pace. The days no longer felt like something to survive. They just existed, simple and steady, the way warmth follows cold. I spent my mornings at the dining table, wrapped in a quilt, reviewing the notebook Dr. Wilson had given me for tracking medication. Grandma always joined me with her cup of black coffee and a crossword puzzle. Sometimes she'd slide a piece of toast toward me and say, "You're looking stronger today," and even if it wasn't true, I believed her. In the afternoons, we'd sit on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the neighborhood move around us, delivery trucks rumbling by, children racing home from school, a mail carrier whistling off-key. The world outside didn't know how close I'd come to disappearing, and maybe that was a gift. Every few days, Mr. Harris, the retired pharmacist who lived across the street, stopped by with a basket of groceries or a magazine for Grandma. He never stayed long, just long enough to ask how I was feeling. "You're getting color back," he said once, and Grandma smiled as if his words could make it true. It was the kind of quiet kindness that asked for nothing in return, and I didn't realize how rare that was until much later. My body was healing, but there were nights when memories worked against me. I'd wake up sweating, the image of that hospital door closing still vivid, my mother's back turned without hesitation. In those moments, Grandma would hear me stirring and knock softly before coming in. She'd sit on the edge of the bed and hand me a glass of water. "Breathe," she'd whisper, as if the word itself could pull me back. Her presence never demanded conversation. She just stayed until the shaking stopped. Weeks turned into months. My strength grew, and so did the space inside me that no longer belonged to fear. One morning I asked if I could start helping more around the house. Grandma hesitated. "You're still recovering," she said, but I could tell she understood what I meant. It wasn't about chores, it was about finding purpose again. So I started small, folding laundry, sweeping the porch, organizing her pantry, until every jar faced the same direction. In the evenings, she'd read while I sat nearby with my laptop. At first, it was just a distraction, but then I found a post on a local tutoring site, parents looking for someone to help their kids with math. I'd always been good at numbers, careful and patient the way you have to be when you've spent your life trying not to make mistakes. I applied without telling Grandma. When I got my first student, a shy 8th grader named Lily, I was nervous. But the moment we began, something clicked. The work wasn't just about equations. It was about seeing someone understand the light in their eyes when confusion lifted. When Grandma found out, she frowned for a moment, then smiled. "I should have known you'd find a way," she said. I promised her I wouldn't overdo it, but she still hovered nearby during my sessions, listening quietly from the hallway. Over the next few months, one student became 3, then 5. The small payments helped cover groceries and gas, but more than that, they reminded me I could build something even from nothing. Still, there were reminders of what I'd lost. Around the time Isabel's college acceptance posts started appearing online, my stomach tightened. There she was on the screen, beaming beside my parents, a banner of balloons behind them. The caption read, "So proud of our girl. Hard work pays off." I stared at it for a long time, waiting for my chest to hurt less. There was no mention of me, not even a quiet note that I was doing better. To the world, I had simply vanished. That photo made something inside me settle differently. I wasn't angry. Anger would have meant I still wanted something from them. What I felt was closer to distance, like watching a storm move over another town. They'd chosen their version of truth, and it didn't include me. But in the quiet of Grandma's kitchen, I had found another kind of truth, one that didn't need proving. One evening as we were cleaning up after dinner, I told Grandma, "I think I'm ready to walk a little farther tomorrow." She looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "We'll go slow," she said. The next morning, bundled in coats and scarves, we walked to the end of the block and turned the corner. The wind was sharp, carrying the smell of wood smoke, but I didn't mind. Each step felt like a small declaration I was still here. As spring approached, the house filled with light again. I helped Grandma plant marigolds in the front yard, their orange petals catching every bit of sun. While we worked, she said, "You're more yourself now than I've ever seen you." I stopped, trowel in hand. "What do you mean?" She brushed dirt from her gloves and smiled. "Your parents always saw you as background, but you were never background, Maddie. You just needed space to grow where no one was standing in your light." Her words stayed with me long after the flowers took root. I realized that everything I'd done surviving the hospital, rebuilding my strength, tutoring those kids, wasn't just about recovery. It was about reclaiming visibility piece by piece. One night, as I sat at my desk preparing lesson notes, I came across an old photo buried in a folder on my computer. The 4 of us standing in front of the church at Christmas, Isabel, holding her new violin, me beside her in a coat 2 sizes too big. My parents' smiles were wide, polished, perfect. Looking at it, I felt no sadness, only clarity. They had built a world that ran on appearances, and I had spent years trying to fit inside it. But here in Grandma's small, imperfect house, I'd found something stronger than approval freedom. By early summer, my tutoring had grown enough to fill most afternoons. The extra income covered my medical prescriptions, and I started saving the rest. When Grandma realized, she protested. "You don't need to worry about money," she said. I smiled. "I'm not worrying," I told her. "I'm planning." She didn't ask what for. She just nodded as if she already knew. That night, as the crickets sang outside and the house settled into its familiar creaks, I lay awake thinking about the future. I no longer imagined my parents' return or their apology. What I saw instead was the quiet power of beginning again, the kind that doesn't announce itself but changes everything in silence. I didn't know it yet, but the calm that wrapped around us that summer was only a pause before something new began. In the stillness of that yellow house, the truth of what had happened was waiting to surface, ready to face the world beyond our safe little street. By late spring, I felt strong enough to move through the days without counting my breaths. The worst of the fatigue had faded, replaced by a kind of steady rhythm that matched the sound of Grandma's footsteps in the hallway each morning. The small yellow house had settled into a pattern that felt almost peaceful. Tea brewing before sunrise, the smell of toast and paper ink drifting from the kitchen table where she read the morning news. Life had become ordinary again in the best way possible, but somewhere under that quiet, something sharper was beginning to take shape. It happened one afternoon while I was sorting through old files on my phone looking for tutoring notes. A folder of screenshots caught my attention, images I didn't remember saving. When I opened them, my chest tightened. One was a message from my mother to Isabel. "Don't worry about your sister. She'll come home when she stops being dramatic." Another from my father. "We can't throw away Isabel's future on a maybe. Madeline's strong. She'll figure it out." I stared at the words until the screen dimmed. They hadn't left me because they were desperate. They had left because it was easier. For the first time, I saw their choice without excuses to cushion it. I closed the phone and sat in silence, feeling something new rise inside me. Not anger, not sadness, but clarity. That night, while Grandma prepared dinner, I mentioned it softly. "They texted Isabel about me," I said, like I was some inconvenience they'd outgrown. She turned from the stove, the ladle still in her hand, her face unreadable. "Some people build stories to make themselves comfortable," she said. "That doesn't make them true." She set the ladle down and looked at me. "You've already proven their story wrong." Her words stayed with me long after we finished eating. Later, while cleaning up, I noticed an envelope tucked under one of Grandma's cookbooks. Inside was a stack of hospital bills stamped "paid in full." At the top, her signature appeared beside a list of donations and grants. She had done it quietly without ever mentioning how. I slipped the envelope back where I found it, my chest aching with gratitude. A few weeks later, I overheard Mr. Harris chatting with Grandma on the porch about a conference for educators that had come to town. He mentioned a woman named Eleanor Stratton, the founder of a scholarship program my parents used to brag about constantly. They'd called her their golden contact, the key to Isabel's future. I remembered dinners where my mother practiced her smile before meeting Eleanor, my father rehearsing talking points about integrity and leadership. That name echoed in my mind for days. I wondered if Eleanor knew. Did she know that the people she endorsed as model parents had once walked away from their own child's hospital bed, that they built their reputation on a lie they never expected to be exposed? The thought sat heavy with me, until one evening as the rain tapped against the windows, I opened Grandma's old desktop computer and began to type. The email started plain. "Dear Miss Stratton, I hope this message finds you well. My name is Madeline Carter. I wrote what had happened carefully without embellishment. I explained that when I was 15, I needed urgent medical treatment, and my parents refused to pay because they had already reserved the money for Isabel's college fund. I attached the proof, the hospital letter, the screenshots of their texts, the note from the social worker. I didn't ask for sympathy or revenge. I just ended with one line I thought you might want to know what kind of people you're endorsing. Then I signed my name. I sat there for a long moment before hitting send. When I finally did, I expected to feel guilt, maybe fear. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. The kind that doesn't come from being seen, but from telling the truth, even if no one else listens. The days that followed passed quietly. I went about my tutoring sessions, my walks, my evening routines. I didn't tell Grandma about the email. Some truths were easier to carry alone. But 2 weeks later, while checking my parents' business website out of curiosity, I noticed something missing. Their homepage had always displayed a gold badge reading, "Proud Partner of the Stratton Scholars Network." It was gone. I clicked through other pages' presentations, brochures, social posts. Every mention of Eleanor Stratton's name had disappeared. Curious, I checked the Foundation's official directory. Their business was no longer listed among approved affiliates. There was no statement or announcement, just silence like a door quietly closing. The change didn't stop there. Over the next month, I saw small cracks begin to spread. A few reviews vanished from their website. One school canceled a planned seminar, another removed their endorsement. Then came whispers in the academic circles my parents had once dominated, rumors that something was wrong, that their image wasn't as pristine as they claimed. Grandma noticed me watching the news one evening and asked if something was bothering me. "Nothing bad," I said truthfully. "Just change." She nodded, accepting that as enough. Summer stretched on, long and hot. Each morning I watered the marigolds while Grandma sipped her coffee in the shade. The phone in the house rarely rang except for my tutoring calls. I began to understand what peace felt like when it didn't depend on anyone else. But even as things settled, the thought of what I'd done lingered at the back of my mind. Not in regret, just awareness. I hadn't sought to ruin anyone. I'd simply shown the truth to the one person whose opinion they valued more than mine ever mattered. And now that truth was doing what truth always does. It was unfolding quietly, but completely. One afternoon as I walked to the library, I passed a group of parents gathered outside the community center. I overheard them whispering my family's last name, their voices low. One of them shook her head. "Such a shame," she said. "They seemed so respectable." I kept walking, the summer heat pressing against my shoulders, realizing that my parents' story was finally being rewritten, just not by them. That evening, Grandma asked if I wanted to help bake a pie. We moved around the kitchen in practiced rhythm, me slicing apples, her preparing the crust. As the oven ticked behind us, she said quietly, "You look lighter these days." I smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." When the pie was done, she set it on the counter to cool, and we sat by the open window. The air smelled like cinnamon and rain. Somewhere outside, a dog barked and the world felt steady again. I thought about how far I'd come from that hospital bed, from the fear that once held me still. I had learned something vital, that sometimes the smallest act of truth can shift everything that once felt unmovable. As the evening light faded, Grandma reached for my hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You've got that look again," she said. "The one you get right before something big changes." She was right. I just didn't know yet how soon that change would arrive, or what it would cost when the past finally caught up with me. The first sign of change came quietly, almost too subtle to notice. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch with Grandma, sorting through lesson plans for my tutoring sessions, when the local newspaper slid out of the mail slot. She handed it to me without looking up from her knitting. "Education section's in the middle," she said. Flipping through, I saw an article tucked between school announcements and community events. The headline read, "Local Academic Consultants Lose Contracts Amid Allegations of Misrepresentation." It didn't name my parents directly, but their business, Carter Academic Strategies, fit the description too perfectly to ignore. The details matched the canceled speaking engagements, the sudden end to partnerships, the quiet disappearance of endorsements. The writer, a young journalist named Rachel Whitman, had pieced together what others had been whispering for months. The article quoted anonymous educators who had once worked with my parents. They spoke carefully, noting that promises were made and not kept, that some families felt pressured by image over integrity. There was no mention of me, of course, but I didn't need one. I could see the edges of my story reflected between the lines. Their reputation, the one thing they valued most, was crumbling. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the creak of the old house and the rhythmic sound of Grandma's breathing from down the hall. It wasn't joy that kept me awake, and it wasn't revenge. It was something quieter, a sense that the balance of things had shifted. I didn't tell Grandma about the article. There were truths that didn't need to be spoken out loud to exist. Days passed and the ripple spread. More clients backed away. Their once busy social media page turned still, the comment sections filled with polite confusion. Then came the update, Carter Academic Strategies shuts its doors after 11 years. Just one line in a short column, but it felt like the closing of a long, bitter chapter. I thought that would be the end of it. But a few weeks later, Rachel Whitman reached out. She found my tutoring website, the one I'd built under my own name. Her email was short. "I'd like to talk about your work with students. You seem to have a gift for rebuilding confidence in kids who've been overlooked." There was no mention of my family. Still, I hesitated before replying. When we met at the library cafe, she was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed kind, with a quiet voice that carried just enough curiosity to be disarming. She asked about my tutoring, how I started, what motivated me. I told her the truth without details that I wanted every kid to feel seen, especially the ones who had been told they weren't enough. At the end of our talk, she asked gently, "Are you related to the Carters who ran the academic firm downtown?" I paused, then nodded. "Yes," I said simply, "but that story isn't about me." She studied me for a moment, then closed her notebook. "No," she said, "I suppose it isn't." A week later, her article appeared online titled, "A New Generation of Mentors, Students Helping Students Find Their Voice." My name was there along with a small photo of me sitting at my desk, a stack of notebooks beside me. It was the first time my name had ever stood alone in print, without comparison, without apology. When Grandma saw it, she folded the paper neatly and placed it on the counter. "You did that," she said, her eyes warm. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. Summer deepened. My tutoring grew beyond what I'd imagined, parents calling from neighboring towns, teachers recommending students who needed extra help. I started hosting small workshops in the library basement, filling the space with laughter and the smell of dry erase markers. Grandma came, sometimes bringing cookies for the kids and listening from the back row. Those evenings felt like the kind of peace I hadn't known could exist. But peace never stays untouched for long. One afternoon, while updating my calendar, I noticed a name on the library's guest list for an upcoming community mentorship conference, Carter Educational Initiative. My breath caught. It was them. My parents had rebranded, trying to rebuild what they'd lost under a new name. Their website was simple, stripped of all the flashy logos, but the names Mark and Catherine Carter were right there. They were hosting a panel at the same conference where I'd been invited to speak about youth resilience. When I told Grandma, she set down her teacup and met my eyes. "You don't owe them a thing," she said calmly. "But if you decide to go, hold your head up. You belong there as much as anyone." The day of the conference arrived with heavy clouds and the smell of rain in the air. The auditorium buzzed with chatter, name tags, rustling, coffee cups clinking. I stood near the back, my notes trembling slightly in my hands. Across the room I spotted them, my parents talking to another speaker near the stage. They looked smaller, somehow tired. My mother's hair was pinned too tightly. My father's suit hung a little loose. Their voices were low, measured, careful. When the moderator introduced me later that morning, I walked to the podium, feeling the weight of a dozen stories inside me: the hospital, the empty chair, the yellow house that saved me. I spoke about resilience, about how some young people find strength in unexpected places. I never mentioned my family. I didn't need to. When I finished, the audience stood to applaud, and I caught sight of them near the door, frozen. My mother's eyes glistened. My father's hand resting uncertainly on her shoulder. Afterward, as the crowd thinned, they waited by the exit. I hesitated, then walked toward them. "Madeline," my mother said softly, "please, just a minute." Her voice shook. "We know we made mistakes," my father added. "We've lost everything." His words came out like a confession, not an excuse. I folded my arms, steadying myself. "You saw the article," I said. "You saw the consequences." My mother nodded, tears gathering. "We didn't think you'd survive," she whispered. We didn't know what to do. I looked at her for a long time. "No," I said finally. "You knew exactly what to do. You just chose not to." My father's voice cracked. "We're not asking for much, Maddie. We just need a little help. We're trying to start over." The words echoed like the ones I'd heard in that hospital room years ago. I thought of Grandma, of the late nights she stayed awake making sure I had what I needed of every person who had shown me kindness when they wouldn't. My voice was calm when I answered. "When I was sick, you said you couldn't afford to save me," I said quietly. "I'm just returning the favor." Their faces fell, but I didn't flinch. I walked past them, the sound of applause from the next session spilling faintly from the hall behind me. Outside, the air smelled of wet pavement. Grandma was waiting near the curb holding my umbrella. She didn't ask how it went. She just pressed the handle into my hand and said, "Let's go home." That evening, as we sat on the porch listening to the crickets, the sky cleared. Grandma poured tea and handed me a blanket. "They tried to erase you," she said softly, "but they failed." I looked out across the yard where the marigolds glowed faintly in the dark, and for the first time I believed her. What I didn't know then was that the story wasn't finished. There was still more to build, more to give, and a future waiting beyond everything that had been lost. After the conference, life moved forward quietly. The air around Grandma's house felt lighter, as if something heavy had finally settled where it belonged. We went back to our rhythm mornings with coffee and crossword puzzles, evenings on the porch with tea and stories about her childhood. The peace between us felt hard-won, but it was real. I didn't hear from my parents again. No letters, no calls. Their business had disappeared, their new venture never took off, and they seemed to fade from the public eye completely. The silence didn't feel empty, it felt earned. I had stopped expecting closure and started building something else instead. Tutoring turned into something bigger that year. The families I worked with began referring friends, teachers started reaching out, and before long, I had more requests than I could handle alone. I set up group workshops at the library, turning those small study sessions into full weekend classes. We covered everything from math and writing to confidence building and interview prep. The first day I walked into that room and saw 20 students waiting for me, I knew something had shifted. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was creating something that mattered. One afternoon, as I packed up supplies after class, a mother approached me. Her son had struggled with reading for years, but after 3 months in the program, he'd made the honor roll. She thanked me, her eyes full, and pressed a small envelope into my hand. Inside was a note written in careful handwriting. "You made me believe I could do it." It wasn't much, but I carried that note in my wallet for months. It reminded me that healing doesn't always come from words, it comes from doing something with the pain that used to paralyze you. Grandma noticed the change in me long before I did. "You're not looking back as much," she said one morning as she poured her coffee. "You're looking forward now." I didn't answer, but she was right. Every time I helped a student find confidence or saw a parent's relief at their child's progress, I felt a quiet sense of peace I couldn't have imagined a few years earlier. A few months later, I received an invitation that stopped me in my tracks, a letter from the State Youth Council asking me to speak at a mentorship summit in partnership with local schools and nonprofits. They'd seen Rachel Whitman's article and wanted me to share my experience running student-led programs. The honor felt surreal. I showed the letter to Grandma, half expecting her to worry about travel or expenses. Instead, she smiled proudly. "You'll do fine," she said. "You were born to teach." The event took place at a lakeside retreat center 2 hours away. I spent the week before organizing notes, practicing in the mirror, and trying to keep my nerves in check. Grandma packed snacks for the drive, slipped an envelope of cash into my purse, and hugged me tight. "Remember," she whispered, "you don't need to prove anything to anyone. Just tell the truth." When I stepped onto the stage that weekend looking out over a crowd of teachers, students, and community leaders, I remembered that hospital room, the silence, the machines, the door closing behind my parents. And then I thought of the small yellow house that had given me back my life. The contrast was almost too much to take in. I spoke about second chances, about the power of one person believing in you when everyone else walks away. I didn't mention names or blame anyone. I just told the truth the way Grandma taught me, simply honestly, without bitterness. Afterward, people lined up to talk, teachers asking about resources, students wanting to volunteer, parents thanking me for the courage to tell my story. When I finally sat down, the event coordinator, a woman named Linda, handed me a card from a representative of a local education foundation. "They'd like to meet with you," she said. Something about expanding your program. That meeting changed everything. Within 6 months, the foundation offered funding to open a community learning center under my direction. It would serve low-income families, providing tutoring, mentorship, and college prep, all free of charge. I named it the Rosemary Project in honor of the woman who saved me when no one else did. The opening day was small but full of life students, laughing volunteers setting up tables, the smell of fresh paint lingering in the air. Grandma stood beside me during the ribbon cutting, holding the scissors with one hand and mine with the other. Cameras flashed, a few local reporters asked questions, but all I could focus on was her face. She was beaming eyes, shining with pride, and something softer peace maybe. When the ceremony ended, we sat on the steps together, watching the sun dip low over the parking lot. "You've done something beautiful, Maddie," she said quietly. "You turned what could have broken you into something that builds others." I leaned against her shoulder, the sound of children laughing echoing through the hallway behind us. A few weeks later, a small article appeared in the paper, "Local Teen Opens Learning Center to Support Underprivileged Youth." There was a photo of me standing with Grandma in front of the building, a banner fluttering overhead. Beneath it, a quote they'd pulled from the interview, "Every child deserves someone who won't walk away." I clipped that article and tucked it into the same folder where I'd once kept those screenshots from my parents. The folder was heavier now, but not with anger. It carried proof that even in the places they tried to erase me, I had written something back. In the months that followed, the center grew faster than any of us expected. Local businesses donated supplies, volunteers offered their time, and the waiting list of students doubled. We started weekend workshops for parents, too, on budgeting college applications and emotional support. Each new session brought faces full of gratitude and stories of struggle that sounded too familiar. I poured everything I had into helping them, determined to make sure no child would ever feel like their life was too expensive to save. Grandma's health began to slow that winter. She tired more easily, sometimes dozing off during our evening shows, her tea cooling untouched beside her chair. When I fussed, she waved me off with a smile. "You're doing enough for both of us," she'd say. Still, I watched her closely, learning the rhythm of her breath the way she once watched mine. On her birthday that spring, I surprised her with a drive to the lake, the same one near the new learning center. I'd been saving for months, and when we arrived, I handed her a set of keys. "What's this?" she asked, brow furrowing. I pointed to a small white cottage tucked beneath a grove of oak trees. The porch had a swing, the windows faced the water, and the air smelled like pine and sunlight. "It's yours," I said softly. Her hands trembled as she covered her mouth. Tears gathered behind her glasses, and she laughed, a sound full of disbelief and joy. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, "you didn't have to." I took her hand and pressed the keys into it. "You once told me everyone deserves a safe place," I said. "This is yours." We spent the afternoon there, sitting by the water, wrapped in blankets. She looked out across the lake, her expression calm, content. "You know," she said, "I used to worry you'd never stop caring what they did to you. But you've built something bigger than all of it." I looked at her, the woman who had chosen love over convenience, action over excuse. And I knew she was right. The pain was still part of me, but it no longer ruled me. As the sun dipped below the water, painting the sky in orange and gold, Grandma reached for my hand. "Promise me something," she said. "Keep choosing to build even when it's hard." I squeezed her hand and nodded. "I promise." Neither of us knew how much that promise would mean in the years ahead, or how soon I'd need to keep it. The summer after Grandma's birthday came slowly, golden and warm, the kind of season that made the air itself feel patient. The learning center was thriving, so full of life that the old brick walls seemed to hum. Mornings began with laughter echoing through the halls, children arriving with backpacks too big for their shoulders. I'd spend the first hour greeting parents, answering questions, making sure everything ran smoothly. But every afternoon, when the rooms grew quiet and the last volunteers left, I'd stop by Grandma's house to check on her. Her health had begun to waver. It wasn't dramatic, just a slower step, a shorter breath, the way she rubbed her wrist when she thought no one was looking. She tried to brush it off, insisting it was just age catching up. Still, I could see the fatigue behind her smile. I brought groceries, tidied the porch, handled the mail. She teased me for fussing, but never sent me away. One evening after dinner, we sat on the couch watching the sun dip below the trees. She turned to me and said quietly, "You know, I never thought I'd live long enough to see you this happy." Her voice trembled slightly, and I reached for her hand. "I owe you everything I said." She shook her head. "No, sweetheart. You owe me nothing. You just made the most of what you were given, and that's what counts." A week later, she was admitted to the hospital. Pneumonia, the doctor said, though her condition was stable. I spent the first night in a stiff chair by her bed, the soft hum of machines surrounding us. She woke briefly around midnight and smiled weakly. "You look tired," she whispered. I laughed quietly. "You're the one in the hospital." She squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't stop living, Maddie, even when I can't be there to remind you." Those words clung to me in the days that followed. Grandma improved slowly, and within 2 weeks she was discharged. We brought her home, and for a while things felt almost normal again. She spent more time in the garden, bundled in a shawl, humming while she tended to her flowers. But the air between us carried a new awareness, unspoken but undeniable. Time was shifting. Then one morning in late September, I got a call from the hospital while setting up for a parent orientation at the center. The nurse's voice was calm, practiced. "She's stable, but you should come. I didn't ask for details. I just drove." The halls of the hospital felt colder than I remembered. When I reached her room, Grandma was resting, eyes closed, the rise and fall of her chest slow but steady. The doctor explained she'd gone into cardiac distress overnight. They'd stabilized her, but she was weak. I sat beside her, the chair too big, the silence too long. She woke an hour later, her gaze finding mine without surprise. "You came fast," she murmured. I smiled through the lump in my throat. "I always will." That night, as the machines beeped softly in rhythm, she asked for tea, and when the nurse brought it, she turned to me. "Remember the promise?" I nodded. "Keep building," she said. Her hand went still in mine, and though I didn't realize it immediately, those were the last words she ever spoke. The days after her funeral blurred together, flowers, quiet condolences, and a house that no longer felt like home. Mr. Harris helped with arrangements, and volunteers from the center delivered food I couldn't taste. I buried myself in work because stopping meant feeling the full weight of her absence. It was a few weeks later, while organizing her papers, that I found the letter. It was tucked inside her Bible, sealed with the same neat handwriting I'd seen on grocery lists and birthday cards. The envelope read, "For Maddie when I'm gone." My hands trembled as I opened it. Her words were simple, written in blue ink. "If you're reading this, then my time here has ended. But don't let grief make you smaller. The world is still wide, and it needs what you're building. Take what we started and make it something no one can take away from you." At the bottom, she'd signed it the same way she always did, "With love, always Grandma." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my journal. That night, I drove to the lake house, the one I'd given her on her birthday. The porch light still worked, flickering softly against the dark. Inside, everything was as she'd left it, the blanket folded on the chair, the teacup by the window, her knitting needles on the table beside a half-finished scarf. I sat there for hours, listening to the quiet lap of water against the shore. When dawn came, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I returned to the Learning Center and called a meeting with the staff and volunteers. "We're expanding," I said. "Grandma always believed education was more than books, it was community. So that's what we're going to build." There was a pause, then applause that filled the room. Over the next year, the Rosemary Project grew into something bigger than any of us imagined. We opened satellite programs in neighboring towns, partnered with local schools, and launched scholarships for students who showed resilience in the face of hardship. We didn't just teach subjects, we mentored, listened, and guided. Every hallway in the center carried a piece of Grandma's spirit, her kindness, her steadiness, her belief that no one was beyond saving. The day we unveiled the new sign outside the main building, the local paper came to cover it. The headline read, "The Rosemary Foundation expands to 3 counties." Standing beside that sign, I felt the breeze lift my hair and thought of Grandma's words, "Keep building." For the first time, I truly understood what she meant. Later that evening, I visited the lake house again. The air was cool, the trees golden with early autumn. I lit a small lantern on the porch and sat with a cup of tea. The scarf she'd never finished was still there, folded neatly where she'd left it. I picked it up, ran my fingers over the soft yarn, and smiled. I kept the promise I whispered, and I'm not done yet. The wind off the water carried the sound of crickets and the faint scent of lavender from the garden. It felt like she was still there, quietly proud, gently watching. I stayed until the stars came out the lake, shimmering under their reflection. Then I stood, locked the door, and whispered goodnight into the wind. There were still more lives to reach, more stories to change. Grandma had given me love. I would spend the rest of my life giving it back. In the months after Grandma's passing, I found myself moving through the world differently. There was a quiet steadiness in me that hadn't been there before, a sense of knowing what mattered and what no longer did. Every morning when I unlocked the doors of the Rosemary Foundation, I felt her presence in the way the light filled the hallways, warm and golden, just like the mornings we used to share over coffee. The center kept growing. We added new programs, hired teachers, and reached kids from towns I'd never even heard of. There were moments that still caught me off guard, the sound of laughter echoing from a classroom, a shy student hugging me. After reading aloud for the first time, a parent's tearful thank you whispered in the hallway. Each one felt like proof that Grandma's promise of love had multiplied beyond anything we could have imagined. I visited the lake house often. It became my quiet place, the spot I went to when I needed to think or just breathe. I'd sit on the porch swing she loved, the one that creaked softly with each sway, and watch the sun drop into the water. Sometimes I'd bring paperwork, sometimes just a cup of tea and the scarf she never finished. The silence there wasn't lonely, it was peaceful, like she'd left a piece of her calm in the air. One afternoon, as I packed up to leave, I noticed a letter tucked under the porch mat. It was from Isabel. The handwriting was careful, smaller than I remembered. She'd written that she'd been following my work from a distance, that she was proud, but unsure how to reach out. I didn't understand back then, she wrote, but I do now. I hope someday we can talk. I read it twice before folding it back into the envelope. For a long time I just stood there, the letter warm in my hand. The years had softened something in me, not forgiveness exactly, but space. Maybe someday we would talk, not to relive the past, but to acknowledge that it had shaped us both. I left the letter on the kitchen table beside Grandma's knitting basket, right where the sunlight hit. Some things didn't need an answer right away. By fall, the foundation had reached its 5th anniversary. We hosted a celebration at the community center filled with families, teachers, and students. Photos of Grandma lined the walls, her smile captured in every stage of her life. During the speeches, I took the microphone last. Looking out over the crowd, I felt the weight of the journey that had brought me there, the hospital bed, the yellow house, the lessons learned in pain and rebuilt in love. I told them about Grandma, about how she taught me that family isn't defined by who shares your blood, but by who stands beside you when the world walks away. I spoke about the power of choosing kindness even after betrayal, of turning survival into service. And as I looked at all those faces, some I'd known for years, others brand new, I realized that justice hadn't come through punishment. It had come through growth, through the quiet act of continuing to give when others stopped believing you could. After the event, I walked outside into the cool evening air. The sky was streaked with orange and violet, and for a moment I could almost hear Grandma's voice on the breeze, calm and certain, keep building. I smiled, knowing I would. These days I still visit her grave once a month. I bring marigolds from the garden she planted and sit beside her headstone, telling her about new students, new projects, new beginnings. The world keeps turning, and I keep my promise. Life has taught me that not every wound needs revenge to heal. Some are mended by time, by purpose, by the gentle persistence of doing good in a world that once looked the other way. What matters isn't who hurt you, it's what you choose to build after. So if you're listening to this and carrying your own kind of hurt, I hope you remember that your story isn't over. You can still create something beautiful out of what broke you. You can still find peace that no one can take. And if Grandma were here, she'd probably smile and remind you, don't stop building. Keep choosing love, one quiet act at a time. Before you go, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and if someone once believed in you when no one else did share their name. Maybe tonight we can honor them together.